You ever notice how the world used to look at India like it was just some side character in the movie of global power? Just the background dancer, not the hero. They thought India was just a land of poverty, spices, yoga, and call centers. They thought it was a country people could ignore, a place with no real say in the world. But let me tell you something right now. That picture is over. That stereotype is dead. And today, the same countries that used to look down on India are sitting in closed rooms whispering, what are we going to do about India? Because India has become the world's biggest fear. And I don't mean fear in the sense of violence or destruction. I mean fear in the sense of power, in the sense of independence, in the sense of a nation that can no longer be controlled. See, the world's been built on control. The West, the so-called powers, they loved having their hands on the strings. They pulled them whenever they wanted. Oil prices, they pulled the string. Trade, they pulled the string. Sanctions, pulled the string. But here's the twist in the story. India cut those strings. And when a country cuts the strings, when it says, you don't control us no more, that's when fear sets in, because suddenly the puppet starts walking on its own. And India, oh my goodness, India ain't just walking. India is running, sprinting, breaking records, climbing mountains, and telling the world, we ain't asking for permission no more. We're taking what's ours. You think the West is mad. They terrified because they've never dealt with a nation like this before. You know what fear looks like? Fear looks like when America wants to sanction Russia, but can't do it without losing India's support. Fear looks like when China flexes its muscles and India stares right back like, try me. I got 1 billion people behind me. Fear looks like when Europe wants to lecture the world on climate change, but realizes India is building solar grids bigger than entire nations and doing it faster, cheaper, smarter. That's fear. Fear is when the old powers know the new game is being written in Hindi, in English, in Tamil, in Punjabi, in Gujarati, in Bengali, because India speaks many tongues, but they all translate to one thing, power. Now, let me break this down for you. Why is India feared today? Because it's got numbers. Numbers don't lie. We're talking about 1.4 billion people. That's not just a statistic, that's a weapon. That's not just a population. That's an army of brains, of hands, of ambition. Every single year, millions of young Indians step into the workforce, and they ain't looking to just survive. They're looking to dominate. They're coding, they're building, they're creating companies that scare Silicon Valley. They're making rockets that land on the moon while other countries are still arguing about budgets. They're inventing medicines, leading hospitals, running global corporations. When you got that many people waking up with ambition in their chest, you don't have a country, you have a storm. And here's the thing about storms, you can't stop them. You can prepare, you can try to hide, but when the storm hits, you're going to know who's in charge. That's why nations are scared. Because India isn't begging for a seat at the table anymore. India is bringing its own chair, putting it down, and saying, we here. Slide over. Let's talk about the military for a second. Oh, don't get it twisted. India ain't just about software engineers and Bollywood movies. India got some serious muscle. And it ain't the old muscle, the borrowed kind, to hand me down weapons from other countries. I'm talking about homegrown power, missiles, fighter jets, nuclear subs, satellites that can look down on any corner of the planet. And then there's BrahMos, fastest supersonic missile in the world. That thing moves so quick it don't ask for permission, it just arrives. That's the kind of power that keeps generals up at night. That's why Pakistan stays jittery. That's why China can't relax. And that's why even America don't talk to India like it's weak. Because when you can fight on land, sea, air, and even space, people treat you different. And let's not forget the economy. See, money is the real battlefield. You ain't powerful until you can back up your talk with cash. India was once the begging bull, asking for aid, looking for loans. But now, India is handing out loans, building roads in Africa, ports in Sri Lanka, airports in Southeast Asia. That's not the move of a weak nation. That's the move of a banker, of an investor, of a player who calls the shots. The IMF used to lecture India. Now the IMF admits that if India stops growing, the whole world economy shakes. That's fear. That's dependence. And let me tell you something else. Independence scares people. India buys oil from Russia when it wants, ignoring Western tantrums. India trades with Iran, partners with Israel, shakes hands with America, and still talks tough with China. It's like India got this swagger that says, I ain't choosing sides, I'm choosing myself. You know how scary that is for the old powers, because they built the system on loyalty. You had to pick a side. But India said, we don't need your side. We are the side. The world's biggest fear isn't India's rise. It's the possibility that India might lead the future. Let me tell you something. It's one thing for a country to grow. It's one thing for a nation to start getting stronger, to have a little bit of progress, to show up on the map. That doesn't scare the world. They clap for you when you're just rising. They cheer you on when you're trying to catch up. But when the possibility comes that you're not just rising, you're about to lead, you're about to take the front seat, you're about to write the future in your own language and on your own terms. That's when fear sets in. That's when the smiles start turning into whispers and the handshakes start hiding claws. India is in that moment right now. For decades, the world looked at India like it was always the supporting actor, never the star. They saw a country full of potential, but in their minds, that potential was always for someone else's benefit. They wanted India to remain the cheap factory, the outsourced labor, the brainpower that worked for Silicon Valley, not the brainpower that could build its own valley. But now, those same people who once overlooked India are realizing that India isn't rising just to participate. It's rising to dominate. And that dominance isn't built on stealing. It isn't built on invading. It isn't built on exploitation. It's built on sheer resilience, intelligence, culture, and unity of vision. That's what's terrifying, because when power comes with morality, when power comes with conviction, when power comes with discipline, it becomes unstoppable. The fear isn't about how many soldiers India has or how many missiles it can fire. Of course, the military is strong, and of course, the weapons are modern, but that's not the root of the fear. The fear is that India is shaping a new order where old powers lose their grip. Imagine the world has been playing a game for centuries, and the same few players have always been in control. They created the rules, they enforced the rules, they broke the rules whenever they wanted. And here comes India, not asking permission, not waiting for an invitation, but quietly building, silently preparing, strategically moving, and suddenly standing in a position where the rules no longer apply to them. That is the nightmare for those who always assumed leadership belonged to them. You know why it's scary? Because India doesn't just bring power, it brings people. 1 billion plus voices, 1 billion plus dreams, 1 billion plus consumers, 1 billion plus innovators. And that's not something you can ignore. That's not something you can suppress. When 1 billion people start moving in the same direction, the earth shakes. The global economy trembles. Industries realign. Political alliances get rewritten. This isn't just rise, this is revolution in slow motion. That's what terrifies the world. And here's the truth, India didn't get here by accident. It didn't stumble into the future. This was years of patience, years of sacrifice, years of vision. The world thought India was distracted, too divided, too complicated to pull it off. They saw diversity as a weakness. They saw democracy as chaos. They saw challenges as permanent roadblocks. But what they didn't understand is that India's strength is in its ability to unify differences, to embrace contradictions, to build harmony out of chaos. Where others saw division, India built resilience. Where others saw noise, India built voices that matter. And that transformation is exactly why leadership is no longer a distant dream, it's a coming reality. The fear of India leading the future is deeper than economics. It's cultural, it's psychological. Because for centuries, certain powers told the story of the world. They decided whose culture mattered, whose history counted, whose voice got heard. They wrote the textbooks, they owned the media, they controlled the narrative. But now, India is telling its own story. India is not just exporting goods, it's exporting identity. Yoga, cinema, spirituality, technology, fashion, even food. Everywhere you look, India's fingerprint is there. And when you change the culture, you change the mindset. Suddenly, people in the West are quoting Indian wisdom. Suddenly, global leaders are paying attention to Indian elections. Suddenly, India isn't a chapter in someone else's story. It's the author of the next one. That's what makes old powers shake. They don't just fear losing economic dominance. They fear losing influence. Influence is the real currency of power, and influence is moving eastward. When young people across the world start looking at India for inspiration instead of the old centers of power, that's when you know the torch is shifting. That's when you know leadership isn't a matter of if. It's a matter of when. And once that shift happens, there is no turning back. Now here's another reason the world is scared. India's rise doesn't come at the expense of others. It comes by lifting itself. See, most empires in history gain power by conquering, by colonizing, by breaking down other nations to build their own. But India is showing a different model. India is building partnerships. India is creating alliances. India is offering technology, medicine, infrastructure to nations that were once ignored or exploited. And when you build power by helping others, by elevating them, your leadership becomes magnetic. Countries want to align with you, not because they're forced, but because they choose to. And when nations choose India over the old powers, that's when fear becomes panic. Because now the game isn't just about competition, it's about replacement. Think about the global economy. For decades, the fear was China. But here's the twist. China's model is built on control, on restriction, on force. India's model is built on democracy, freedom, and creativity. Which one do you think the world trusts more in the long run? Which one do you think other nations will follow willingly? That's why India's potential leadership is scarier. It's sustainable. It's not dependent on fear. It's built on respect. And respect is a power multiplier no military can match. Technology is another piece of the puzzle. The future belongs to whoever controls technology. Artificial intelligence, space exploration, digital infrastructure. These are the battlegrounds of tomorrow. And right now, India is not just competing, it's excelling. Look at the space missions, the satellites, the digital payment systems, the startups flooding the global market. India is building the kind of future that even developed nations are struggling to keep up with. That's not just progress, that's leapfrogging. That's skipping steps and landing in the front. And when you leapfrog, you scare the ones who spent centuries climbing slowly to the top. Education is another weapon in India's arsenal. The world underestimated the power of millions of engineers, doctors, scientists, and innovators coming out of Indian universities year after year. At first, they were happy to hire them, to bring them abroad to use their skills. But what happens when those same minds decide to stay home? What happens when the brain drain becomes brain gain? Suddenly, the innovation isn't happening in California. It's happening in Bengaluru. Suddenly, The breakthroughs aren't coming out of London, they're coming out of Hyderabad. Suddenly, the patents, the research, the discoveries aren't feeding someone else's economy. They're feeding India's. That's the kind of shift that keeps old powers awake at night. Let's talk about leadership style too. India doesn't shout its dominance. It doesn't pound its chest every time it achieves something. India plays the long game. Quietly, strategically, steadily. And that calm confidence is frightening. Because you can argue with arrogance, you can confront aggression, but you can't stop quiet confidence. It doesn't give you a target, it doesn't give you an opening. By the time you realize what's happening, the game is already won. That's why India's potential leadership feels inevitable. It's not a question of if, it's a question of timing. And timing matters. Right now, the world is facing crisis. Economic crisis, climate crisis, political crisis. Old powers are distracted, fighting their own internal battles. But India is focused. India is stable. India is positioning itself as a problem solver, not a problem maker. And in a world hungry for solutions, the one who offers answers becomes the leader. The one who brings calm in chaos becomes the anchor. That's why people fear India leading the future, because the timing couldn't be more perfect. The truth is, fear is just respect in disguise. When nations say they fear India's rise, what they really mean is they respect India's ability to change the game. They know that if India takes the lead, the world won't look the same. The old privileges won't exist. The old hierarchies will collapse. The old centers of power will fade into the background. That's the real fear. Not India's growth, but India's leadership. Not what India is today, but what it's becoming tomorrow. India is not just a participant in the global future. It is the architect of it. And when you're the architect, you don't just build your own house, you design the entire city. You decide the layout, the flow, the structure. That's what leadership looks like. And that's exactly what makes the rest of the world nervous.